So I got myself a new toy. I went to my local K-Mart and they were selling all of their stock because they're closing down, and they were getting rid of all of their old power mobility scooters. Now these things are in the stores, you've probably seen them a million times. If you have any sort of walking disabilities, or if you can't manage to walk around the store comfortably, you can utilize these scooters to get place to place, and you can put all your contents in the basket to check out. Now, my local Kmart had a whole bunch of these sitting around because, like I said, they were closing, and they were selling them for $50. So naturally, I could not pass this up. And here's the kicker. It actually works. So naturally I nabbed myself a new toy, and not knowing exactly what to do with it, I asked you guys to a YouTube community poll what I should do with it, and I gave you 3 options. Tracks, big balloon snow tires, or just making it generally all-terrain. And the majority of you guys just want this to be an off-road beast, so that's the plan. Now, I haven't come up with exactly how I'm gonna do that yet. Is it weird that I'm so excited about this? Not gonna lie, this is probably one of my favorite purchases to date. I think my co-host approves. So I've never actually built any sort of go-kart or off-road rig before, aside from the tank and of course the wheelchair, which was a small-scale electric. This is going to be my first time, so I'm looking forward to learning what I can from this and hopefully ending up with something a little obscure and a lot awesome. So a while back, a guy I used to know in Montana who had one of the best scrapyards I've ever seen gave me a bunch of parts to work with. I've got some old 4-wheeler shocks here, both a set of front and a set of rear, and because I'm skeptical of the speed potential and power potential of the electric motors, we're gonna upgrade. These carts are crazy. I've never actually ridden on one, of course, but I was looking at the stats here, and the user weight capacity is 500 pounds with an extra large basket, which this is, capacity of 250 pounds. So this cart is capable of moving around 750 pounds. That's more than my quarter-ton pickup truck. I'm gonna try to keep this as close to the original scooter design as I can, keeping the seat where it is, keeping the basket, keeping that for steering, keeping the frame and the look, because I want it to be a off-road mobility scooter still. I won't explain too terribly much now because it'll make more sense when you have something to look at to go along with it. As far as I know, no one's ever done this before, so I'm kind of working from scratch here. Okay, fun's over. Now that I've had my fun, it's time to take this puppy apart. Let's get serious. Just kidding, nothing we do on this channel is serious. We can get a better look at that front wheel. I think that thing is tiny. So it appears as though almost all of the actual structural frame, not including the bumper here, is made of 1 inch by 1 inch square tubing, so that makes it really easy to work with. So many good parts. So check this out, the charger is actually held on with nothing but rubber bands. This is seriously one of my best finds yet. All of this for 50 bucks. I've got the motor and the rear axle here with the differential, and then I've got my 24-volt charger here, I've got my motor controller there, and I've taken all the electronics out and set them on top of here, and I've put it all back together because I want to keep the mobility scooter image, and so I'm going to stick with that for the steering interface. And my current plan is to actually make the frame for the front suspension completely a separate unit that just bolts to the bottom of this. Rather than trying super hard to modify this whole thing, I think it'll behoove me just to go with the subframe idea. Guys, I finally figured out the aspect ratio on my camera to get those stupid black lines that ran here and here away, so you guys get full screen now, and I am so relieved about this. Whenever I watch YouTube videos, those things just annoy the heck out of me. So anyway, I got this completely stripped down, and upon thinking about it, I'm definitely going to tackle the front end first. That way I'll be able to build the back end accordingly, because there's going to be a lot more work that goes into this. So this is our donor vehicle. This is a Mastercraft riding lawnmower. Okay, so I've removed the front axle and the back transmission. We won't really use much from back here. This whole thing will end up being thrown in the scrap. This is our front axle. What I'll probably end up doing is cutting it about there and about there, and then welding a piece of flat bar across there to bridge that, and then I'll attach our A-arms to that. And I'll explain the A-arm suspension a little bit in case you're not familiar. Now, old non-running riding lawnmowers where I'm from are kind of a dime a dozen. You can find them for free all over Facebook and Craigslist, so I'd recommend searching your local areas if you're interested in something like this, because it's a whole lot cheaper to go this route than it is to buy all the parts online. So this is a rough approximation of how single A-arm suspension works. This is the system we're going to be using for the scooter because it's quite simply the cheapest and the most simple. So basically this arm is just rotating around this axis, so it goes up and you're not riding on this surface of the wheel anymore, you're riding more on the corner. I don't think that'll be an issue with the wheels that we have, simply because they're not a flat-ended wheel. For example, something like the shape of this Tate, to where once you were up here, you would lose traction and expedite wear of the tire. These are lawnmower tires, which are quite rounded in shape, so I think as it moves, I just can't see any issues, hence why we're going with it. Now, this is not to scale, of course, and this is also probably not the exact configuration that we'll be using and how everything will look in the final product, but just to give you guys an idea. So hopefully you guys can hear me over the rain, but the first big expense is here. This is the steel I'll need for putting together all the suspension parts and whatnot, as well as the hardware. Well, it's not pretty, but it's strong and functional, so we've got our first main part done, and now we need to do a little bit more thinking and some more calculations. This front axle is what we'll be salvaging all the steering and spindle parts from. Now, a really important factor in determining how wide to make this whole thing is that you don't want your tires rubbing, so you want to be able to go to a full turn, which of course brings the tire a lot closer to the vehicle itself. So if we kept this the same width and had the pivot point centered where it is now, you can see that now if we were turning and the spring was in a compressed state, you might have issues with the tire rubbing on here, which could be catastrophic. Alright, so I got these cut off, and this axle material is actually a lot thicker than I thought it was. Looks like it's about 1/8 of an inch. One thing I'd like to mention is I'm going with a 1/4 inch plate here instead of my usual 1/8 inch material, just because there'll be a lot of stress on this joint, and I want to make sure it's as strong as it needs to be. Okay, so these plates are all welded on now, and one thing I'd like to mention is you really want to keep your heat away from the bushings here to avoid melting them. And if you don't want to take the tires off, then I would advise at least putting a wet rag over it to make sure that you don't have any hot bits of metal that burn through the rubber. Okay, bad news guys, I have to start thinking again. So I've got one of my tires strapped onto my table, and I got it all squared up with a square so I know that it's perfectly up and down. And I've got this resting on something that has about the right height to give me the angle that I want. I have to keep this far enough away from the center of the frame itself so that I've got enough room to put the shock in place. So at this point, I'm really just going to do a lot of eyeballing, and then I'll measure the angles on this one side and then replicate it on the other. So just something to keep in mind real quick. This doesn't need to be super precise, it just needs to be safe, strong, and symmetrical between both sides. Okay, so a good chunk of the front suspension is now coming together. So the way I went about making the tabs for the A-arms was just cutting a 1-inch piece of that 1-inch by 1-inch material, drilling a hole through it to accept a 3/8 inch bolt, and then welding it onto the A-frame itself. You can see I did that on both sides. Then of course, in order to get the correct rotation, I had to round the edges of that 1-inch by 1-inch with an angle grinder, and that was a piece of cake. As far as the mainframe side itself, I've just got a piece of 3/16 inch 1-inch flat bar here with another 3/8 inch hole drilled through it, then a piece of 1-inch by 1-inch angle iron on this side, and of course that side with also holes drilled in it to just act as anchor points for either side of this bolt. So you can see it's really quite simple. I'm gonna get that welded together, and then we don't really have that much left to do. It's really funny. I'm like just good enough at building to get the stupid ideas like this to actually work. Alright, so I added the shock absorber mounts. I just made it a 1.5 inch by 1.5 inch square tubing. And now all I'm doing is I'm mounting the shocks themselves so I can get a good idea of how tall the suspension towers need to be. Now this is where we determine the height of our suspension tower. So I've got a square set up there with measured increments on this side, of course. What I'm going to do is I'm going to place this in line with these angled pieces where there'll be another piece coming up, and then determine exactly where on the ruler it falls, and it looks like it's just about at 9 inches. Now that's not taking into consideration this extra 1/4 inch or so on the bottom, but I've determined that on one of these springs on my full weight, I can compress it by about 1/2 inch. And so if I divide that between the two, that 1/4 inch is actually just about perfect. So what I'll do is I'll just stick to this 9-inch measurement, which will actually be 9 1/4, and that'll result in this thing being hopefully just about level when someone of my weight sits on it. Although it doesn't really matter that much. Do you ever feel like you get carried away every once in a while with a project? Yeah. This thing is going to be super tippy. I'm thinking that I might need some kind of support between here and here. And if you look from this angle, in theory we should be able to run something straight across without interfering with our steering. But it's coming along pretty well. I'm actually pretty satisfied with it. I'll probably end up flipping the whole thing around, so these tie rod attachments for the wheels, which of course control their angle, will end up being in the back. That way if I hit something, it doesn't damage the tie rod, it just hits this A-arm. So I'd like to get the front end completely done before I move on to the back, and I'm just dismantling the steering column now, and I'm amazed at how chintzy this thing is. So what'll end up happening for the steering is, because the top of our chassis there will fit flush with here and here. We're going to want to mark this and then bring the line up about 1/2 inch. And then I'll bridge this gap with a piece of flat bar, bring an arm over, and then bring a bolt down, and that's what our tie rods will hook to. So I've been thinking about it, and this motion here, the turning of the wheel relative to the body itself, I've got it hanging up in case you're wondering, doesn't really need to move all that far. So what I'm thinking is we'll deal with a 1-to-1 distance between the lever on our steering column and then the lever on our wheel. And what that looks like, if we measure from the center of the pivot point where it's mounted over to the center of the hole, it's almost exactly 3 inches. So that's what I'm going to do. So this is the steering column. That's really it. All the modifications we had to do, I drilled a 3/8 inch hole, keeping that same 3 inches that I just talked about from the center of this all the way to that hole. So now time to mount it and see how she works. Just a quick update. I decided that giving each tie rod its own independent hole would be a much better idea than having them share a pivot point in the center, so that's exactly what I've done. Okay, so I'm making my own tie rod ends because I'm too cheap to buy them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one 3/8 inch hex nut and then a 3/8 inch washer and weld them together. So this will technically be the tie rod, and then this will be where it connects to either the wheel end or the steering end. One thing I'd just like to mention real quick is that make sure when you're welding it on, you leave enough space for the bolt to spin completely, because if you have this nut all the way butted into the washer at one of these flat points, obviously at that point you'd lock it in place and this wouldn't be able to turn. So just keep that in mind. Or just, you know, buy real rod ends. Okay, we're officially put together on the front end with the exception of mounting this chassis I made to the deck itself, which is the next step. And I'll probably just do that off camera and then show you guys because it's pretty self-explanatory. Just gonna drill some holes, put some bolts through here and here, and then cinch them down tight. Like I was saying, the tie rods are done. This is just some 3/8 inch threaded rod that of course is threaded into the nuts on either of my tie rods, and that's done on both sides. I just eyeballed lining them up to make sure that the wheels were in the front and back direction, and also that this was in the front and back direction at all times, and then I made sure that my tie rods were even, and that's front and back, and the wheels are front and back, so I wouldn't say that was too bad. And we're bolted on. That's connected to the frame, and I went ahead and put the basket back on because, well, where else am I going to put my groceries? There's only 3 things left to do on the front. And that's support the A-arms, which I'm definitely still going to do, support each suspension tower against each other, and reinforce the steering column. Now, I changed my mind a little bit on supporting the A-arms. What I ended up doing is cutting these triangles out of 2 inch by 8 inch flat bar and just welding in place to support this. I didn't think it was necessary to use up some more 1x8 material just to go from here to here, when this will probably do the same job. We've got our suspension, we've got solid steering, and that concludes the front end. So I've been mulling over in my mind different ideas of how I'm going to do this, because I need to be able to add suspension but not make it independent, because independent suspension is a lot more expensive. I'm trying to keep the cost down, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep a straight axle along the back and try to move it probably a little bit further back than what it was, because I'm increasing the distance from the ground on this thing and it's already a pretty tippy vehicle with how far up you sit. I want to try to extend the footprint in every direction as far as I can within reason. So I'm just going to give you guys a preliminary idea of what I'm going to do. I'm thinking that I'm going to keep these bars here, here, and here, and cut this back one out, and then this here will be where the engine sits. And I'm going to put a hinge here, and then on the other side there, come down, and then over. And that's going to be where the engine mounts. Behind the engine is going to be where the rear axle is. And behind that rear axle is going to come up, and of course it'll be all boxed in and framed, and then the suspension will connect to the back. And I'm going to create a top up here, just a frame, just so the engine has room to move up and down. So of course I measured, but upon dry fitting, this engine fits in there just about perfectly. So I think this is going to end up being its home, probably somewhere around there. So this is our donor rear axle. We're going to be taking the transmission off. We're not going to use that because it'll be more of a straight axle go-kart type setup. But now we need to determine whether or not it's reasonable to put the engine and the bearing mounts for this on the same level. So it looks like it's about 9 inches to the bottom of that shaft. So it might be reasonable to assume that we need to drop the axle and the bearings down below the same frame that the engine is actually mounted on. So let's see. So the reason we're doing this is because we've already established our ground clearance on the front. And so I want to keep this deck level if I can. So that's the consideration I'm using when mounting this. So I said 9 inches, and that's not quite gonna cut it. So you can see that 9 inch measurement that I just mentioned is just exactly about an inch below the bottom of the rubber mounts on the engine, which is just about perfect. I'm working on that rear So I'm working on the rear underframe right now that the engine and rear axle are going to be mounted on, and I've got these two big frames, and I have to use 1 3/4 inch blocks between them to keep them spaced enough for my pillow blocks, and you'll understand everything I mean as soon as I'm finished with it and I'll do an overview. But I thought I'd use this as an opportunity just to remind you guys never to throw little bits of steel away, because those 1 3/4 inch bits can be made out of just about any scraps that I have lying around, so that is where they come in handy and why I never throw anything away. Some call it hoarding, I call it material management. Do you ever make really dumb mistakes because you forgot that you changed your own plans? Yeah, me neither. Guys, look at this design. The set screws that are designed to hold this thing on the axle are right behind the bolts that hold the sprocket itself to the hub. Who designed this? I've got this lower frame kind of just sitting together right now with the engine on it. I've got the pillow blocks in place, I've got my rear axle, my brake drum, and my sprocket in place. And this chain is just resting there, but I have everything together just so I can guide you through some of my thought processes in placement and attaching points. So I've got my suspension tabs mounted here, and these will end up containing these shocks just like that. So as far as the engine placement, I'm going to put it pretty centrally located on this, and here's why. I need enough space back here for the shocks to be able to move, and I need enough space up here because when that pivot point pivots and the springs get compressed, this will move up, and the top of this will come closer to my seat post. So in working out where to put our pivot point, I'm probably going to roughly center it in between the two tires, and my reason for that is if I keep it forward a little bit, I'll have more leverage against those rear springs and it'll be a little bit softer, because what I'm worried about is that those things will be quite stiff. They're from a four-wheeler, and a four-wheeler, of course, with its frame, its engine, and its rider is going to be a lot heavier than this. So if I position myself a little bit further away from that pivot point, I'll have more of an effect on those springs, and hopefully it'll be able to absorb a little bit more impact. So for a hinge of sorts for the pivot point, what I'm going to be doing is using this 1/2 inch black iron pipe and these 1/2 inch bolts. These 1/2 inch bolts are 3 inches long, and what my plan is to cut 2 inch sections out of this pipe and then use that as a collar to weld to my arms for the rear platform, and then simply make ears coming from the frame of the scooter itself that I can run this through both sides. Now, 1/2 inch bolts fit nicely into the 1/2 inch pipe, and a little bit of grease should make a nice hinge. So I got the arms done that go up to attach to the bottom of the deck of the scooter itself, and you can see my hinge mechanism is really quite simple, because I really don't see a need to overcomplicate anything. I mean, it's just a simple pivot point. It needs to be strong and it needs to be safe. Those are really the only two criteria. Now I'm going to weld this up on end like that at the bottom of the deck, so it runs along this way. That'll give me plenty of contact, and it'll also bring this down a little ways from the deck surface itself, and I feel like it'll just make motion a little bit easier. So I got my rear suspension mounted, and the engine is just sitting in place on those rails for now, but I've got this brace done, welded on both sides, just on the end of the rail, just on the end of those original forks coming out of the back of the scooter, and I've come up, over, down, very simple setup. You can see I've given this a little bit more drop on the back in its static resting position, and that's just to make up for the amount of compression on the rear springs and my weight is in it. I really don't have that much left to do. I'm definitely not going to be satisfied with the strength of just one rail, so that rear suspension frame is officially done. I went with the most straightforward design I could think of. It still leaves plenty of space for the engine to sit down in there, and I don't really have to worry about it jumping up and hitting anything because this is far enough back. Okay, so I'm working on the engine now because we have to have a way to control the throttle valve, which is this one right here. Not sure how well you can see that. And that right there is as complicated as things need to get. Be sure to leave a little bit of slack in between the engine and your frame itself, just to allow for a little bit of flexibility and movement, because again, compression of the suspension. Well, the gas is done. It's a little janky, but it works. I was able to use most of the parts left over from the scooter. This is the back piece of the scooter frame that I cut out to make room for the engine, and then this is the tie rod, and I bent it down just a little bit to keep it more out of the way. Also, it shortened the distance from here to here just a little bit. So, as you can see, this does its job. It's pretty simple, and this arm pushes on this other arm, which has the same length between the pivot points as this one does, just to keep it a 1-to-1 movement. And then I have a bolt here, and through that bolt I drilled a hole just big enough for this cable to fit through, so I can go on. So I come on this side, tighten down that nut, which is held in place by a lock washer, and then that will keep the cable from moving, and that also allows for a little bit of room of adjustment. And then of course, I need a spring, so I just simply went from the frame to here. So I got the brake done. I went with a simple handbrake design because since I already have a foot pedal down here for the gas, I wanted to be able to stabilize myself with the other foot because of the tipping hazards here, and I can get a lot more leverage with this and more effectively stop myself. One more addition is I actually took the old bumper that ran around the back that just bolted on the front and then bolted on the rear, and I cut out the center portions just like you see and welded them in place, and that provides a nice bumper here, some stability for this rear support, and it looks really cool. So all that being said, I actually took this out for a test drive and had some issues with the rear axle. So you won't be seeing how I made this one. I'm gonna remake one that's all one piece so I don't have to worry about welding anything and getting everything perfectly straight. And I'm gonna show you how I did that now. Let me show you what we're working with. A piece of 1-inch shaft that's 36 inches long, and this will be basically our entire axle. This is what the rear axle looks like of a riding mower. You've got these sort of slots that line up with corresponding slots in the wheels themselves, and then those shapes obviously allow it to turn as one, and we need to replicate this. Okay, I got my axle in place. It's ran all the way through and exactly centered, hopefully, and it has set screws and each pillow block holding it in place so I know it won't move. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get the sprocket positioned exactly where I want it in line with the centrifugal clutch, and then come over to the brake and do the exact same thing with the hoop. So once those are completely lined up, I'm going to mark either side of each one with a Sharpie, and I'm going to cut the keyways in each one, and I'll show you how I do that. So I've got my marks here and here for where I'm going to put my keyways, and this is the point where I tell you, do not try this at home. This is a horrible idea, don't do it. I don't have a milling machine, so I don't really have a way to get a super even cut on this, so I'm going to be doing it with my angle grinder. And if you're not familiar with what a keyway is, both the sprocket and the brake has these little square bits of metal, and these act as mechanical blocks. So they fit in a removed portion of the shaft that's exactly half the depth of this, and then the other half of the block sits up in either the sprocket or the brake, and so it doesn't allow it to turn. So we have to get that exact 1/4 inch wide, 1/8 inch deep cut in this. And the only way I can think to do that is with an angle grinder with 5 blades on it. But these 5 blades exactly equal the 1/4 inch I need to fit this into, and it'll give me a nice even cut. So that's what I'm going to do, but I would not advise it. Just buy an axle, guys. It's so much easier. Okay, so now that the working life of my angle grinder has been shortened substantially, I'm going to show you what I did. As you can see, I've cut these slots, and it actually fits this keyway really nicely. Now, after you get that laid down to that 3/4 inch diameter, you just need to put these little tabs on it. As you can see, the original one had that fits into the rim, and I made them extend up a little bit longer just so it would go in a little further, so I'd have some stay out here to put a pin through. But that's really all there is to it. So I just took this thing out on this first maiden voyage with the new axle, and it handled beautifully. This thing honestly did way better than I thought it would, and it is such a blast. But I'm gonna have to call the video here. This has already been pretty long and full of talking information. So if you enjoyed it, don't forget to leave a like. This thing was so fun to build, and I hope you enjoyed seeing the process. But since I'm losing daylight today, test video is gonna have to wait till tomorrow. What do you think, co-host? I'm gonna do some quick adjusting on it, put a spring on the brake lever, clean out the carburetor, just do some little stuff like that. But overall, we're pretty much done. So I'll film a test video tomorrow and put it through its paces, go over some bumps at high speed, maybe even a jump or two, because of course, and we'll take you guys along for the whole ride. So I think that's all for now, and if you don't want to miss the video of the test drive, then don't forget to subscribe, guys. Also, I'd like to apologize for assaulting your guys' ears in the furnace video. You guys let me know it was a little annoying, and I watched it back, and you were absolutely right. But I guess I didn't see it in editing. So in this video, I hope it's a little bit more tolerable to listen to, because I'm still trying to get this whole editing thing down. Also, thank you to everyone who responded to my YouTube poll on giving me suggestions on what I should do with this. This was a little out of my wheelhouse, but honestly, it was a fun challenge, and I'm really happy I went with it, and I hope you were too. But anyway, don't forget, like, subscribe, comment, share, and I'll talk to you in the next one.